Welcome, dear listener. Let your eyes grow heavy if they wish. Find a comfortable position, whether you're lying in bed or settling into your favorite chair. Take a deep breath in and let it out slowly. Tonight, we're going on a journey together, a journey into the mysterious depths of the ancient Greek underworld. But don't worry, there's nothing to fear in this place. We're not descending into some fiery pit of torment, but rather into a realm of profound mystery, where shadows dance with purpose, and where one of the most misunderstood gods in all of mythology holds court. His name is Hades, and his story is far more nuanced, far more compelling than you have probably been told. So relax, breathe deeply, and let my voice guide you as we explore the truth about the Lord of the Dead, his magnificent kingdom beneath the earth, and the love story that changed the seasons forever. There's no rush. We have all the time in the world, and the gates of the underworld, well, they're always open to those who seek knowledge. Beyond the stereotypes, reclaiming Hades from misrepresentation, let's address the elephant in the room right away. Or perhaps more accurately, let's address the fire-haired, fast-talking villain in the animated film. If you grew up in the 1990s or early 2000s, your first encounter with Hades was probably through Disney's 1997 animated feature, Hercules. In that film, Hades is portrayed as a scheming, villainous god with blue flames for hair that turn red when he's angry, a fast-talking demeanor reminiscent of a sleazy car salesman, and an insatiable desire to overthrow Zeus and rule Mount Olympus. He's funny, sure. James Woods gave an undeniably memorable performance, but he's also unequivocally evil, plotting to kill his infant nephew and unleash the Titans to destroy the gods. This portrayal was so successful, so memorable, that it's become the default image many people have of Hades. The problem? It's almost completely wrong. In fact, it's so far removed from the actual Greek myths that when Disney tried to release the film in Greece, they had to market it as beyond the myth of Heracles to avoid a national backlash. Even that didn't work particularly well. The Greek people were understandably frustrated to see one of their ancient deities transformed into a cartoon villain that bore no resemblance to the god their ancestors actually worshipped and told stories about. But Disney isn't alone in this misrepresentation. The 2010 film Percy Jackson and the Olympians, the Lightning Thief, also portrayed Hades as a villain, complete with devil-like horns and a demonic appearance. The 2012 film Wrath of the Titans continued this trend, depicting Hades as a scheming antagonist who betrays his brothers. Even video games and young adult novels often fall into this trap, presenting Hades as either outright evil or, at the very least, morally dubious, constantly plotting against the other gods and resentful of his position as ruler of the underworld. Why does this happen? Why has Hades been so thoroughly vilified in modern popular culture? The answer lies in a fundamental misunderstanding, or perhaps a deliberate conflation, between Hades and the Christian concept of Satan or the devil. To modern Western audiences, especially American audiences, raised in a predominantly Christian cultural context, the ruler of an underworld filled with the dead seems like an obvious parallel to Satan, the ruler of hell. Both preside over realms associated with death and darkness. Both are cast as antagonists to the main divine figure, Zeus or God. It's an easy comparison to make, but it's fundamentally flawed. The ancient Greeks did not have the same dualistic worldview that characterizes Christianity, where good and evil are locked in eternal cosmic battle, with God representing absolute good and Satan representing absolute evil. Greek mythology was far more nuanced, far more ambiguous. The gods were not moral exemplars. Zeus himself, the king of the gods, was a serial adulterer who frequently raped mortal women and even deceived his own wife. Poseidon had a terrible temper and would destroy entire cities in fits of rage. Aphrodite caused wars with her manipulations. Ares reveled in bloodshed. Hera was vindictive and cruel to the innocent children of Zeus's affairs. By comparison to these gods, Hades was actually remarkably well behaved. The ancient Greeks didn't view Hades as evil at all. They feared him, certainly. Death is frightening, and Hades represented the inevitability of death, the final destination that awaited every mortal regardless of their wealth, power, or virtue. But fear is not the same as moral condemnation. Hades was feared in the same way that death itself is feared, not because death is morally wrong, but because it's final, unknowable, and inescapable. In the ancient sources, Homer's epics, Hesiod's poems, the various Homeric hymns, and the works of later playwrights and poets, Hades is consistently described as stern, inflexible, and somewhat cold, but also just fair and surprisingly compassionate in certain circumstances. He's not a torturer of souls. He doesn't personally punish the wicked. That's the job of the Furies, the Erinyes, who serve as prosecutors and executioners for those who have committed particularly heinous crimes. Hades himself is more like an administrator, a cosmic bureaucrat who ensures that the natural order is maintained and that the boundaries between life and death are respected. One ancient text that really drives this home is the satirical work by Lucian of Samosata, a 2nd century author who wrote Dialogues of the Dead. In these witty philosophical dialogues, Hades is portrayed in a surprisingly positive light, even comically so. He's shown trying to solve problems for various famous dead people, reasoning with them, showing patience and even compassion. In one memorable dialogue, the Greek hero Protesilaus asks Hades to let him return to the world of the living to be with his wife, who's still alive. Hades is skeptical at first, but when Protesilaus reminds him that Hades himself knows what it's like to be in love, referencing his relationship with Persephone, and that Hades had previously made similar allowances for Orpheus and Alcestis, Hades relents, persuaded by Persephone's gentle urging. This is not the behavior of a villain. This is not the action of a god who delights in suffering or who hoards souls out of pure malice. This is the behavior of someone who, while bound by cosmic rules and responsibilities, still has compassion and understanding for the pain of others. In fact, if you look through Greek mythology, you'll struggle to find a single story where Hades acts as a villain in the way modern media portrays him. There's no myth, not one, where Hades attempts to overthrow Zeus or seize power from the other Olympians. Ironically, there are several myths where other gods did try to overthrow Zeus. In Book 1 of Homer's Iliad, we're told that Hera, Poseidon, and Athena once conspired together to bind Zeus while he slept and overthrow him. The plan only failed because the sea nymph Thetis summoned one of the Hecatoncheires, a 100-handed giant, to free Zeus before the other gods could finalize their coup. But Hades, he wasn't involved. He wasn't even mentioned. He was down in the underworld, doing his job, completely uninvolved in Olympian politics. This isolation from Olympian affairs is actually one of Hades' defining characteristics. Unlike his siblings, who constantly meddled in mortal affairs, took sides in wars, played favorites with heroes, and generally caused chaos with their interventions, Hades stayed in his realm. He cared little for the world above. His attention was focused on his duties, receiving the dead, ensuring they were judged fairly, preventing escape from his realm, and maintaining the cosmic boundary between life and death. He rarely attended the gatherings on Mount Olympus, and when he did appear, it was typically for important cosmic business, not social calls. This tendency to avoid the other gods actually worked against Hades in terms of his reputation. The Greeks, being a bit superstitious about death, avoided saying his name too often, fearing it might attract his attention. They used euphemisms instead, calling him Ploton, meaning the wealthy one, referencing his dominion over the earth's mineral riches, Clymenus, meaning the renowned, Eubuleus, meaning good counselor, or even the unseen one, which is actually what the name Hades itself derives from. This reticence to speak openly about Hades meant that fewer temples were built to him, fewer festivals celebrated him, and fewer elaborate myths were told about his exploits. He became mysterious through absence, and that mystery bred fear, which over millennia transformed into the modern misconception of villainy. But there's another reason for this misrepresentation, one that's worth acknowledging. Hades is associated with death, and death makes for a convenient antagonist. In storytelling, especially in the action-adventure genre that includes most modern adaptations of Greek mythology, you need a clear villain for the hero to fight against. Zeus, as the king of the gods and often the father of the hero, doesn't work well as an antagonist, though he arguably should be, given his behavior in the myths. Poseidon causes problems, but is often portrayed as temperamental rather than evil. But Hades, the dark lord of the underworld, ruler of the realm of death, that's an easy villain to write. It requires no nuance, no complex moral reasoning. Death is the ultimate enemy, and the god of death becomes the ultimate villain. It's reductive, but it's dramatically convenient. What we're going to do over the course of this exploration is reclaim Hades from this misrepresentation. We're going to look at the actual myths, the ancient sources, the real character of this misunderstood god, and I think you'll find that the truth is far more interesting, far more nuanced, and far more compelling than any cartoon villain could ever be. Hades is not a demon or a devil. He's not evil or malevolent. He is simply the god who rules where all mortals must eventually go. And perhaps in the final reckoning, he's one of the most honest and straightforward gods in the entire Greek pantheon. Persephone, the beginning, birth, family, and the division of the cosmos. To understand Hades, we need to start at the beginning. Not his beginning specifically, but the beginning of the Olympian order itself. The story starts with the Titans, the generation of gods who ruled before the Olympians, and specifically with Cronus, the leader of the Titans and the father of the Olympian gods. Cronus himself had come to power through violence. His father was Uranus, the personification of the sky, and his mother was Gaia, the personification of the earth. Uranus, in his cruelty, imprisoned several of Gaia's children, the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires, monstrous but powerful beings, deep within the earth, causing Gaia tremendous pain. In her anguish and rage, Gaia fashioned a sickle from adamant, an indestructible material, and gave it to her son, Cronus. She asked him to castrate his father, to take revenge for the imprisoned children, and to end Uranus's tyranny. Cronus agreed. When Uranus came to lie with Gaia, Cronus ambushed him and castrated him with a sickle, throwing the severed genitals into the sea. From the blood that dripped onto the earth, the Furies were born, along with other beings. From the foam that formed around the genitals in the sea, Aphrodite eventually emerged. Uranus, in his agony, cursed Cronus, prophesying that one day Cronus's own children would overthrow him just as Cronus had overthrown his father. This curse haunted Cronus. When he took his sister Rhea as his wife and queen, and when she began bearing children, Cronus became paranoid. He knew the prophecy. He knew that one of his children was destined to overthrow him. His solution? He decided to swallow them whole, alive, as soon as they were born. It was a horrifying solution, but in Cronus's mind, it was the only way to prevent the prophecy from coming true. And so, one by one, as Rhea gave birth to her children, Cronus swallowed them. First came Hestia, the goddess who would later preside over the hearth. Cronus swallowed her. Then came Demeter, who would become the goddess of agriculture and harvest. Cronus swallowed her too. Then Hera, who would become the queen of the gods and goddess of marriage, swallowed. Then came Hades, the firstborn son, who would become lord of the Underworld. He too was swallowed, trapped in his father's belly. Then came Poseidon, future lord of the seas, also swallowed. Now you might be wondering how the children survived inside Cronus's stomach. The answer is that they were gods, immortal beings. They couldn't die. Instead, they simply continued to exist inside their father, growing and maturing, trapped in darkness, waiting. It's hard to imagine what that existence must have been like for them. Consciousness without freedom, awareness without the ability to act, years or perhaps decades passing in a living prison. It would leave anyone with some emotional scars. Rhea, meanwhile, was devastated. She had lost 5 children to her husband's paranoia and cruelty. When she became pregnant for the 6th time, she knew she had to do something different. She couldn't bear to lose another child. However, she went to her parents, Gaia and Uranus, seeking advice and help. Together, they devised a plan. When Rhea gave birth to her 6th child, Zeus, she hid him away on the island of Crete, in a cave on Mount Ida. There, he was protected by magical beings. The nymphs nursed him, the Curettes danced and clashed their weapons to mask his cries, and a goat named Amalthea provided milk for him. Meanwhile, Rhea took a large stone, wrapped it in swaddling clothes to make it look like an infant, and presented it to Cronus. In his paranoid haste, Cronus didn't examine the bundle too carefully. He simply swallowed it whole, believing he had once again prevented the prophecy from coming true. Zeus grew up in secret, far from his father's reach. When he reached adulthood and his full power, he knew it was time to fulfill the prophecy and free his siblings. Different versions of the myth tell this part differently, but the core story remains the same. Zeus, with help from various allies, managed to get Cronus to regurgitate his siblings. In some versions, Zeus disguised himself as a cupbearer and gave Cronus a potion that caused him to vomit up everything he had swallowed. In other versions, Zeus simply used his divine power to force Cronus to disgorge his children. One by one, the swallowed gods emerged: Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, and Hestia, in reverse order from how they had been swallowed. They emerged as adults, fully grown gods who had somehow matured despite their imprisonment. Imagine that moment. Hades, who had been the first swallowed, was now the last to emerge. He had spent more time than any of his siblings, trapped in that living darkness. If anyone had reason to be bitter, angry, or twisted by their experience, it would be Hades. Keep that in mind as the story continues. Now free, the 6 younger gods faced a choice: seek revenge against their father, or forgive and then forget. Being Greek gods, revenge was definitely on the table, but more than personal vengeance, there was a cosmic principle at stake. Cronus and the other titans represented the old order, a regime characterized by tyranny and paranoia. The younger gods, led by Zeus, saw an opportunity to create something new, something better, or at least something they controlled. But they couldn't do it alone. Zeus and his siblings needed allies, and they found them in unexpected places. First, they freed the Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants whom Uranus had imprisoned and whom Cronus had kept imprisoned as well. In gratitude, the Cyclopes forged mighty weapons for the 3 brothers. For Zeus, they created the Thunderbolt, the most powerful weapon in the cosmos, capable of striking down even immortals. For Poseidon, they forged the Trident, a 3-pronged spear that could command the seas, shake the earth, and create devastating earthquakes. And for Hades, they created the Helm of Darkness, also called the Helm of Invisibility, a helmet that rendered its wearer completely undetectable, invisible not just to sight, but to all senses. The younger gods also freed the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed giants with 50 heads each, beings of immense power who could hurl boulders like rain. With these allies, Zeus and his siblings declared war on Cronus and the Titans. The war that followed was called the Titanomachy, and it lasted for 10 years. It was a cosmic conflict on a scale almost impossible to imagine. Mountains were used as weapons. The earth shook. The sea boiled. The sky burned. Titans fought with the strength of primordial beings, while the younger gods fought with divine weapons and strategic cunning. Hades, wearing his Helm of Darkness, became a devastating warrior on the battlefield, an unseen threat who could strike without warning, who could sow confusion and fear among the Titans' ranks. He proved his ferocity and skill in combat, helping to turn the tide of the war in the younger gods' favor. Finally, after a decade of fighting, the younger gods won. The Titans were defeated, and the victorious gods faced the question of what to do with them. Zeus's judgment was harsh but definitive. The Titans, including Cronus himself, would be imprisoned in Tartarus, the deepest, darkest pit of the cosmos, even deeper than the Underworld itself. Tartarus was described as being as far beneath the Underworld as the earth is beneath the sky, an abyss of absolute darkness, surrounded by bronze walls and wrapped in 3 layers of night. There, the Titans would remain imprisoned for eternity, guarded by the Hecatoncheires, unable to threaten the new cosmic order. With the old regime defeated and imprisoned, the victorious gods now had to decide how to divide the cosmos among themselves. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades were the 3 brothers, the 3 most powerful of the younger gods. And it was clear that they would be the primary rulers of this new order. But how should the cosmos be divided? Who would rule what? According to Homer's Iliad, the most ancient and authoritative source for this story, they decided to settle the matter by drawing lots. They would leave the decision to chance, avoiding potential conflict by letting fate choose their domains. It's worth noting that this approach, using random chance rather than fighting among themselves, shows a wisdom and restraint that would characterize the relationship between these three brothers. They had just fought a 10-year war. They were exhausted. The last thing they wanted was to immediately turn on each other. So they drew lots and the division was made. Zeus drew the sky, the heavens, the realm of clouds and storms and lightning. He would become the king of the gods, ruling from Mount Olympus, the highest peak in Greece, where the gods would make their home. Poseidon drew the seas, all the oceans and waters of the world, becoming the lord of the deep, the earth shaker whose moods controlled the tides, and whose anger could sink entire fleets. And Hades drew the Underworld, the realm of the dead, the vast kingdom beneath the earth where all mortal souls would eventually come. The earth itself was considered common ground, accessible to all three brothers, though Poseidon and Zeus could easily travel there, while Hades rarely left his realm. Mount Olympus, though physically part of the earth, became the domain of Zeus and the other Olympians. The underworld became Hades' exclusive realm, and he became its absolute ruler. Different sources tell this story slightly differently. Some suggest that Hades wasn't unhappy with his lot at first, but that over time he came to resent being separated from his siblings and excluded from Olympian society. Others suggest that Hades immediately recognized the value of his domain. After all, every mortal dies, which meant that eventually all of humanity would become his subjects. Death is democratic. It comes for everyone regardless of status or wealth. In ruling the dead, Hades ruled more souls than any other god. There's an interesting version of the story, not from ancient sources, but from later retellings, that suggests the lots weren't entirely random, that Zeus, being clever, may have manipulated them somehow. According to this version, Hades suspected as much, but didn't press the issue. He accepted his lot with dignity, even if it meant isolation from his siblings and relegation to a realm that others would fear and avoid. This characterization of Hades as someone who accepts his responsibilities with stoic resignation, even when those responsibilities are difficult or unpleasant, matches well with his portrayal throughout Greek mythology. The relationship between the three brothers after the division was complex. Zeus, as king of the gods, technically had authority over his brothers, but in practice, each ruled their domain absolutely. Poseidon was known to be temperamental and occasionally challenged Zeus's authority, even joining that plot with Hera and Athena to overthrow him at one point. But Hades? He remained removed from such conflicts. He didn't attend most of the gatherings on Olympus. He didn't compete with his brothers for power or prestige. He simply went down into his realm and began the long work of building and organizing the underworld, creating the systems and structures that would process and house the countless souls of the dead. This separation from his siblings must have been difficult, especially after they had just fought together for a decade to defeat the Titans. But Hades adapted to his isolation. He built a palace deep within the underworld, a magnificent structure made of precious metals and gems. After all the mineral wealth of the earth technically belonged to him. He appointed various spirits and minor deities to help him manage his realm. He established rules and systems to govern the flow of souls and maintain order in his domain. And he settled into his role as the Lord of the Dead, becoming the god who would be most feared, most avoided, and yet most essential to the cosmic order. But Hades wouldn't remain alone forever. Eventually, he would desire companionship, a partner to help him rule his vast kingdom. That desire would lead to one of the most famous myths in all of Greek mythology, the abduction of Persephone, the event that would explain the cycle of the seasons and give Hades his queen. But before we get to that pivotal story, we need to understand what exactly Hades was ruling. We need to explore the underworld itself to see the geography and structure of this shadowy realm that lay at the heart of Greek beliefs about death and the afterlife. The architecture of the underworld, a guided tour of Hades' kingdom, the Greek underworld, the realm that Hades ruled, was not a simple place. It was not just a shadowy void where ghosts wandered aimlessly. Instead, it was a complex, structured realm with distinct regions, rivers, landmarks, and hierarchies. Understanding the geography and organization of the underworld is crucial to understanding Hades himself, because the nature of his kingdom reflects the values and beliefs of ancient Greek culture regarding death, justice, and the afterlife. Let's start with the most famous feature of the underworld, the rivers. There were 5 major rivers that flowed through or around the underworld, each with its own unique properties and significance. These rivers weren't just geographical features, they were sacred boundaries. They had their own divine personifications, and they played crucial roles in the journey of the dead. The river Styx is by far the most famous. Its name means hateful or shuddering, and it was the primary river that separated the world of the living from the realm of the dead. The Styx was so powerful, so inviolable, that the gods themselves swore their most sacred oaths upon it. When a god swore by the Styx, they were absolutely bound to keep that oath. To break an oath sworn on the Styx would mean terrible punishment, including being forced to lie unconscious for a full year, followed by 9 years of exile from the company of the gods. The river Styx was personified as a goddess, a daughter of the Titans Oceanus and Tethys, who aided Zeus during the Titanomachy, and was thus honored with this special status. In the Iliad, when the goddess Thetis wants to make Achilles invulnerable, she dips him in the waters of the Styx, though famously, she holds him by his heel, leaving that one spot vulnerable, which would eventually lead to his death. The river Acheron, whose name means river of woe or river of sorrow, was another major waterway of the underworld. In some traditions, it was the main river that Charon, the ferryman of the dead, would navigate to transport souls to their final destination. The Acheron was said to flow with pain and lamentation. In later geographical understanding, there were actual rivers in Greece and southern Italy that bore this name, places where the physical world seemed to touch the mythical realm of the dead. Homer's Odyssey mentions the Acheron as one of the rivers flowing through the underworld, a place of grief where the shades of the dead would gather. The river Cocytus, the river of wailing, was a tributary of the Styx, and its name perfectly captured its nature. This was a river of lamentation, where the sounds of mourning and weeping echoed eternally. According to some traditions, souls who couldn't pay Charon's toll would be forced to wander the banks of the Cocytus for 100 years before being allowed to cross. Plato, in his philosophical writings, described the Cocytus as circular, emptying into Tartarus, and associated with the punishment of murderers. The geography of the underworld, even in ancient times, varied depending on which poet or philosopher was describing it, but the Cocytus consistently remained a place of sorrow and punishment. The river Phlegethon, also called Persephone, was the river of fire. Its name literally means flaming or burning, and it was described as a river not of water but of flames, of liquid fire that flowed through the underworld. According to Plato's cosmology, the Phlegethon coiled around the earth before plunging down into the depths of Tartarus, where it became associated with the punishment of those who had committed acts of violence. The river of fire was a place of purification through burning, of punishment through pain, though Hades himself wasn't portrayed as presiding over these punishments directly. Finally, there was the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, or river of oblivion. This was perhaps the most poignant of the 5 rivers, because it dealt with memory and identity. Souls who drank from the Lethe would forget their previous lives, losing all memory of who they had been, what they had done, the people they had loved. This forgetting was sometimes portrayed as a mercy, a way for souls to let go of the pain and attachments of mortal life. But it could also be seen as a kind of death within death, an erasure of personal identity. Some traditions held that souls destined for reincarnation would drink from the Lethe before being sent back to the world of the living, ensuring they had no memory of their previous existence. The Lethe flowed near or through Elysium in some accounts, suggesting that even in paradise, the past had to be released. Interestingly, the Orphic mystery religion, which offered initiates special knowledge about the afterlife, warned souls not to drink from the Lethe, but instead to seek out the pool of mnemosyne, memory, suggesting that remembering one's true divine nature was crucial to escaping the cycle of death and rebirth. These 5 rivers were the liquid boundaries and pathways of the underworld, but they weren't the only means of entering Hades' realm. To get to the underworld, a soul first had to cross one of these rivers, typically the Styx or Acheron, and that crossing was facilitated by Charon, the ferryman of the dead. Charon was an ancient figure, possibly predating even the Olympian gods in Greek religious thought. He was depicted as an old man with a scraggly beard, often portrayed as gruff and unfriendly, piloting a simple boat or skiff across the dark waters. But Charon wouldn't ferry just anyone across. He demanded payment. An obol, a small coin for his services. This is why ancient Greeks practiced the custom of placing a coin in or on the mouth of a deceased person during funeral rites. Without that coin, the soul couldn't pay Charon, and without payment, Charon wouldn't provide passage. Souls who couldn't pay were doomed to wander the shores of the river for 100 years before being allowed to cross. This practice reveals something important about Greek beliefs. Proper burial rites mattered. A soul without a proper burial, without that coin for Charon, couldn't fully enter the afterlife. This belief led to the Greek horror of being left unburied, and it explains why heroes like Odysseus and Aeneas made such efforts to ensure their dead companions received proper funeral rites. Once across the river, souls would approach the gates of the underworld itself. These gates were guarded by perhaps the most famous figure associated with Hades, Cerberus, the three-headed dog. Cerberus was no ordinary animal. He was a monstrous creature, sometimes described as having a serpent for a tail and snakes growing from his back and mane. His three heads allowed him to watch in all directions at once, ensuring that no living person entered without permission, and, more importantly, that no dead person escaped. Cerberus was said to be friendly to the newly dead as they entered, but savage to anyone trying to leave. This reflected one of Hades' primary concerns, maintaining the boundary between life and death, ensuring that the dead stayed dead. Various Greek heroes encountered Cerberus in their adventures. Heracles, as one of his 12 labors, was tasked with bringing Cerberus up from the underworld to the world of the living. Hades, showing his fairness and willingness to honor heroic achievement, agreed to allow this, but only if Heracles could subdue Cerberus without using weapons. Heracles managed to wrestle the great beast into submission through sheer strength, brought him to the surface to show King Eurystheus, and then respectfully returned Cerberus to his post at the gates of the underworld. Orpheus, the legendary musician, managed to charm Cerberus with his music, lulling the great hound to sleep so he could pass. These stories consistently show that Cerberus, while fearsome, could be overcome through exceptional skill, strength, or talent, but only by the truly heroic. There's an interesting linguistic note about Cerberus. Some scholars believe that the name Cerberus might derive from a word meaning spotted, or might be related to a word that simply means spot, making Cerberus's name potentially equivalent to calling him Spot, one of the most common names for a dog. Hades, the stern lord of the dead, called his faithful guardian Spot. It's a humanizing detail that suggests Hades had affection for his monstrous pet, seeing in him not a terrifying beast, but a loyal companion. Greek art often depicted Cerberus being petted by Hades or that Persephone, reinforcing this idea that the three-headed dog was more than just a guard. He was a beloved pet, the good boy of the underworld. Past Cerberus, through the gates, lay the underworld proper, and here the geography becomes truly fascinating because it wasn't one uniform realm. The underworld was divided into distinct regions, each serving a different purpose and housing different categories of the dead. These divisions reveal how the Greeks thought about morality, justice, and the meaning of a life well or poorly lived. The vast majority of souls went to a place called the Asphodel Meadows, sometimes just called Asphodel. This was a neutral realm, a place of neither reward nor punishment, reserved for ordinary people who had lived ordinary lives, neither particularly virtuous nor particularly wicked. The name comes from the asphodel plant, a flower that often grew wild in Greek meadows. The asphodel meadows were described as misty, dim, and somewhat melancholy. Souls there existed in a shadowy, diminished state. Homer describes them as shades, insubstantial, ghostly versions of their former selves. They retained their memories and some sense of identity, but they lacked the vital force, the life energy, that had animated them when alive. They couldn't affect the physical world. They experienced no physical pleasures or pains, and their existence was generally described as monotonous and gray. It wasn't torment, but it wasn't paradise either. It was an eternal, directionless existence, a faint echo of life. In Book 11 of the Odyssey, Odysseus visits the underworld and speaks with a shade of Achilles, the greatest Greek hero of the Trojan War. Achilles tells him something profound and sobering. I would rather be a paid laborer working for a poor man, a man who had little to live on, than be king over all the dead. This sentiment encapsulates the Greek view of the asphodel meadows. Existence there was so diminished, so gray and lifeless, that even the greatest heroes would prefer the hardship of mortal life to the empty eternity of the average afterlife. This wasn't a punishment. It was simply the natural consequence of death for most people. But not all souls went to asphodel. Those who had lived exceptionally virtuous lives, or who had been particularly favored by the gods, or who were great heroes, might be sent to Elysium, also called the Elysian Fields, or the Isles of the Blessed. This was the Greek concept of paradise, a place of eternal spring, beautiful weather, lush gardens, and happiness. Souls in Elysium could enjoy all the pleasures they had enjoyed in life, but without any of the pains. No illness, no aging, no suffering. They could feast, engage in athletic competitions, make music, and generally live in eternal bliss. Elysium was described as being located at the western edge of the world in some traditions, or as a special section of the Underworld in others. Access to Elysium wasn't typically based on moral virtue in the Christian sense. It wasn't about being good or pious. Rather, it was about heroism, about greatness of spirit, about being favored by the gods. Heroes like Achilles, eventually, after his time in Asphodel, the demigod Heracles and others were said to reside there. Some traditions held that if a soul was sent to Elysium 3 times through reincarnation, meaning they lived 3 virtuous lives in a row, they would be sent to a final paradise called the Isles of the Blessed, from which they would never need to reincarnate. Hades didn't directly judge who went to Elysium. That was the province of 3 judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus. These were mortal men who had been so renowned for their wisdom and justice during their lives that Zeus appointed them as judges of the dead after their own deaths. Minos, the legendary king of Crete, held the final deciding vote when the other 2 judges disagreed. Rhadamanthus judged the souls of Asians, while Aeacus judged Europeans. Together, they assessed each soul's life and determined its appropriate destination. Hades supervised this process and enforced their judgments, but he didn't make the decisions himself. This is an important point. Hades wasn't capricious or cruel in assigning fates to souls. He was following a judicial process, maintaining order and justice, even in the realm of death. At the opposite extreme from Elysium was Tartarus, the deepest, darkest part of the underworld, the pit of punishment for the worst offenders. Tartarus was as far below the rest of the underworld as the earth was below the sky. In other words, incredibly distant and deep. It was described as being surrounded by bronze walls, wrapped in 3 layers of night, and so dark and dreadful that even the gods feared it. Hesiod, in his Theogony, says that an anvil would take 9 days to fall from the earth to the underworld, and another 9 days to fall from the underworld to Tartarus, giving us a sense of its tremendous depth. Tartarus was primarily a prison. This was where Zeus had imprisoned the Titans after the Titanomachy, where they were guarded by the Hecatonchires and kept forever separated from the rest of the cosmos. But it was also where particularly wicked mortals were sent to receive eternal punishment for their crimes. These weren't just ordinary sinners. These were people who had committed offenses so heinous, so blasphemous, that they merited special, ongoing punishment. The most famous residents of Tartarus's punishment section are known for their eternal torments. Tantalus, who had killed his own son and served him as food to the gods to test their omniscience, was condemned to stand in a pool of water beneath a fruit tree. Whenever he bent down to drink, the water would recede. Whenever he reached up to eat, the branches would lift away. He was eternally tantalized, the origin of our word tantalize, by sustenance he could never obtain. Sisyphus, who was known for his craftiness and who had twice cheated death itself, was condemned to roll a massive boulder up a steep hill. Every time he neared the top, the boulder would roll back down, and he would have to start again, forever engaged in pointless, exhausting labor. Ixion, who had attempted to rape Hera, was bound to a burning wheel that spun through the sky for eternity. The Danaides, 49 sisters who had murdered their husbands on their wedding night, were forced to carry water in leaky jars, trying to fill a bathtub that would never be filled. Tityos, who had attempted to rape Leto, was stretched out over 9 acres of land, while vultures eternally ate his liver, which regenerated each night so the torture could continue the next day. These punishments were savage, certainly, but they weren't arbitrary. Each punishment was designed to reflect the crime. Tantalus, who had abused the hospitality of the gods and had tried to trick them, was eternally denied basic sustenance. Sisyphus, who thought himself cleverer than death, was given meaningless eternal labor. The Danaides, who had murdered in violation of sacred marriage vows, were trapped in an eternally incomplete domestic task. These were carefully designed torments that reflected Greek ideas about cosmic justice and the importance of honoring the gods, respecting sacred bonds, and accepting one's mortality. Importantly, Hades himself didn't design these punishments. He didn't torture these souls personally. That was the job of the Furies, the Erinyes, ancient goddesses of vengeance who predated even the Olympians. Hades simply maintained the prison, ensured the punishments continued, and prevented escape. He was the warden, not the torturer. This distinction is crucial because it further separates him from the Christian concept of Satan or the devil, who is often portrayed as gleefully tormenting the damned. Hades took no pleasure in suffering. He simply ensured that cosmic justice was served. There was also a region called the Fields of Mourning, mentioned in some sources, particularly in later Roman interpretations, like Virgil's Aeneid. This was a place for souls who had died of broken hearts, or who had been consumed by unsuccessful love. It was a melancholy place of eternal sadness, where those who had been destroyed by love wandered in grief. This region highlights how the Greeks and Romans understood that emotional and psychological suffering could be as significant as moral wrongdoing, worthy of its own space in the afterlife. At the center of all this was the House of Hades, also called the Palace of Hades, where Hades himself resided. This was described as a magnificent structure, though its magnificence was dark and imposing rather than bright and welcoming. The palace was said to be made of precious metals and stones, gold, silver, and gems, reflecting Hades' association with the mineral wealth of the earth. Some sources describe it as having many rooms, each serving different administrative functions. Rooms where the newly dead would be processed, rooms where the judges would make their determinations, rooms for Hades's various attendants and servants. The palace would eventually become home to Persephone as well, after she became queen of the underworld. According to some accounts, Persephone brought changes to the underworld when she arrived, making it less grim and more organized, bringing a touch of life and growth even to the realm of death. Her presence alongside Hades created a ruling partnership, a divine couple who together maintained order and justice in the afterlife. The underworld was also home to various spirits and minor deities beyond Cerberus and the Furies. Thanatos, the personification of death itself, resided there. Though he was a separate entity from Hades, Hades ruled the dead, but Thanatos was the one who actually took mortal lives. Hypnos, the god of sleep, and twin brother to Thanatos, also made his home in the underworld, in a cave near the river Lethe. The Keres, spirits of violent death and disease, dwelt there. Various demons and phantoms served different administrative functions. The underworld was, in a strange way, a busy place, a realm that required maintenance and management. One final, important note about the geography. There were multiple entrances to the underworld, scattered throughout the Greek world. Most mortals entered through death itself, their souls guided by Hermes Psychopompos, Hermes the soul guide, to the banks of the Styx. But there were also physical locations, caves, chasms, certain lakes and springs that were said to be entrances to the underworld, places where the boundary between worlds was thin. Cape Matapon in southern Greece was said to house an entrance. Lake Avernus in Italy was another. Various caves in Greece and Asia Minor were identified as gates to Hades. These locations were sacred and fearful, places where the living could theoretically enter the realm of the dead, though doing so was incredibly dangerous and generally reserved for heroes on special quests. This, then, was the kingdom that Hades ruled, a vast, complex realm with multiple regions serving different purposes, intricate systems of rivers and boundaries, judges and guardians, punishments and rewards. It was not a simple hellscape of fire and torment. It was a carefully organized cosmic necessity, the place where all mortals must eventually go, where justice would be served, and where the natural order of life and death would be maintained. Hades was the absolute ruler of this realm, and his rule was characterized by inflexibility, fairness, and a deep commitment to maintaining the boundaries between life and death. He was not a demon or a devil. He was an administrator, a judge, and a king ruling over the greatest and most inevitable kingdom in the cosmos, the kingdom that would eventually claim us all. Hades as ruler, justice, order, and the nature of death. Having established what Hades ruled, let's now explore how he ruled, what kind of god he was, and what his personality and character were really like, according to the ancient sources. This is where we can most clearly see the discrepancy between the modern stereotypes and the actual mythological figure. The ancient Greeks described Hades with a consistent set of attributes. He was stern, uncompromisingly so. He was cold, remote, and unemotional in his official capacity. He was inflexible about his rules and showed no favoritism. He was feared, certainly, but he was also respected because he was just. In Agamemnon's famous rhetorical question from the Iliad, why do we loathe Hades more than any god, if not because he is so adamantine and unyielding? we see both the fear and the grudging respect. Hades couldn't be bribed, couldn't be persuaded to bend the rules, couldn't be charmed or threatened into showing mercy where mercy wasn't warranted. He represented the absolute finality and inevitability of death. But stern and inflexible doesn't mean cruel or malicious. One source explicitly states that while Hades was stern, cruel, and unpitying, he was still just. That's a crucial distinction. Hades enforced cosmic law. He maintained boundaries that needed maintaining. Death, after all, is not a negotiable thing. It comes for everyone eventually, and it needs to be permanent. If souls could freely leave the underworld, if death could be easily reversed, the entire natural order would collapse. Hades understood this, and he took his responsibility seriously. Greek attitudes toward Hades were complex and somewhat contradictory. On one hand, he was the most feared and avoided of all the gods. Greeks rarely said his name directly, preferring euphemisms like the wealthy one, Pluton, or the unseen one, Hades itself, or the renowned, Clymenus. They avoided attracting his attention. They avoided building temples to him, and they generally tried not to think about him too much. This wasn't because they thought he was evil. It was because thinking about death is uncomfortable, and Hades represented death's inevitability. On the other hand, when they did worship Hades, it was with respect and even gratitude. Farmers knew that Hades, as Pluton, was associated with the fertility of the earth and the mineral wealth beneath it. The earth's fertility came from the underworld. Seeds were planted in the ground, which was Hades' domain, and they drew their nourishment from the soil, which was under his governance. The association between Hades and agricultural fertility, particularly through his marriage to Persephone, meant that he wasn't just a god of death, but also, paradoxically, a god connected to life and growth. When Greeks made sacrifices to Hades, they performed them differently than sacrifices to other gods. Sacrifices to the Olympians were typically performed at altars, with the smoke rising up to the heavens. Sacrifices to Hades and other chthonic underworld deities were performed differently. The blood of the sacrificial animal would be poured into a pit or hole in the ground, abothros, allowing it to seep down into the earth, into Hades' realm. The person making the sacrifice would turn their face away, averting their eyes from the offering. Black sheep were often chosen as sacrificial animals for Hades, reflecting the darkness of his realm. These rituals show that Greeks saw Hades as fundamentally different from the sky gods, requiring different forms of worship and approach. One of Hades' defining characteristics was his zealous guarding of his realm's boundaries. He became quite enraged when anyone tried to leave the underworld or when someone tried to steal souls from his domain. This wasn't cruelty, it was duty. The dead needed to stay dead. That was his job, his cosmic responsibility. When Heracles came to take Cerberus, Hades allowed it, but only under strict conditions. When Orpheus came seeking to bring Eurydice back, Hades set a test, a condition that would prove whether Orpheus was truly worthy of such an unprecedented favor. When Theseus and Pirithous came to the underworld attempting to abduct Persephone herself, Hades trapped them, binding them to seats from which they couldn't rise. Heracles later freed Theseus, but Pirithous remained trapped as punishment for his audacity. These stories consistently show Hades enforcing boundaries, while also showing unexpected mercy or flexibility when approached respectfully and when circumstances warrant it. He's not a villain who delights in preventing reunions or causing pain. He's a ruler who takes his responsibilities seriously, but who can be moved by extraordinary circumstances or exceptional individuals. Hades' personality is described as somewhat passive. Unlike Zeus, who was constantly interfering in mortal affairs, taking sides in wars, fathering demigod children, and generally causing drama, Hades stayed in his realm and focused on his duties. He cared little about what happened in the world above. His primary concern was his own domain. He didn't compete with other gods for worshippers. He didn't get involved in the squabbles and politics of Olympus. He simply did his job, maintaining the underworld, receiving the dead, ensuring justice was served. This passivity extends to his personal behavior. Unlike virtually every other male god in Greek mythology, Hades was not a serial philanderer. Zeus had countless affairs with goddesses and mortal women. Poseidon fathered numerous children with nymphs and mortals. Apollo had many lovers: Ares, Hermes, Dionysus. All of them engaged in romantic and sexual relationships beyond their primary partnerships. But Hades? Once he married Persephone, he was faithful to her. There's a single exception mentioned in some sources: a nymph named Minthe, who was associated with the river Cocytus. According to these accounts, Minthe boasted that she was Hades' lover and that she was more beautiful than Persephone and would replace her as queen. Persephone's response was swift and brutal. She trampled Minthe and transformed her into a mint plant. In some versions, Hades was the one who transformed Minthe, feeling pity for her after Persephone's wrath. But this is the only extramarital affair attributed to Hades in any ancient source, and even then, it's unclear whether it occurred before or after his marriage to Persephone, and some sources suggest it may have been nothing more than Minthe's own delusion or boasting. This fidelity is remarkable when compared to other Greek gods. It suggests that Hades, despite ruling a realm associated with darkness and death, had more self-control and more respect for his marriage vows than virtually any other god. It also suggests that his relationship with Persephone, however it began, became a genuine partnership. Together, they ruled the underworld as king and queen, and accounts consistently show them working together, making decisions together, and supporting each other. When Orpheus came seeking Eurydice, it was Persephone who helped persuade Hades to allow the attempt. When heroes came to the underworld seeking favors, both Hades and Persephone would be involved in the decisions. They were partners in rulership, not adversaries. Hades' association with wealth is another important aspect of his character. The title Platon, or Pluto, means wealth or wealthy one, and this wasn't just a euphemism to avoid saying his name. It reflected a genuine aspect of his domain. All the precious metals and gems of the earth, gold, silver, copper, iron, diamonds, rubies, emeralds, technically belonged to Hades because they came from beneath the earth, from his realm. Mining was, in a sense, extracting Hades' wealth. The earth's fertility, the crops that grew from the soil, were also connected to Hades. Death and life, wealth and decay, were all intertwined in Greek thought, and Hades embodied these paradoxes. This association with wealth led to Hades being worshipped by those seeking prosperity, particularly farmers and miners. Prayers for successful harvests or successful mining operations might be directed to Hades as Plauton, the wealthy one who controlled these resources. This positive aspect of Hades, as a giver of wealth, as a provider of earthly riches, balanced the fear associated with him as the god of death. He was more complex than simply the god of death. He was the god of everything beneath the earth's surface, everything hidden, everything that came from the depths. The Greeks also credited Hades with a certain dry wisdom and even dark humor. In Lucian's satirical dialogues, Hades is portrayed as witty, patient, and even somewhat philosophical. He's shown reasoning with demanding souls, patiently explaining why certain requests can't be granted, and occasionally being persuaded by good arguments. This portrayal may be comedic and exaggerated, but it suggests that Greeks didn't see Hades as humorless or purely grim. He was serious, yes, and stern, but he had intelligence and even a certain sardonic appreciation for the ironies of existence. Another important aspect of Hades' character was his role in oaths. The river Styx, which was part of his realm, was the most sacred oath in Greek religion. When the gods swore by the Styx, they were calling on Hades' domain as witness to their promise, and the penalties for breaking such an oath were severe. This gave Hades a kind of passive power over even the other gods. They might not invite him to their parties or seek his company, but they relied on his realm to guarantee the most important promises and contracts. He was the ultimate guarantor of sacred oaths, the one who ensured that cosmic law was honored. In terms of his appearance, ancient art typically showed Hades as a mature, bearded man, similar in appearance to Zeus, but darker and more severe. He was often depicted seated on a throne made of ebony, holding a staff or scepter, sometimes holding the horn of plenty, cornucopia, to represent his wealth, and often accompanied by Cerberus. He wore a crown, or sometimes the helm of darkness. Unlike Zeus, who was often shown with dynamic poses and expressions, Hades was usually portrayed as still, seated, immovable, like death itself, which doesn't rush or chase, but simply waits with eternal patience. The helm of darkness, his signature attribute, was a fascinating symbol. It granted perfect invisibility, making him undetectable to all senses. Some scholars interpret this not just as literal invisibility, but as a metaphor for death's unseen nature. We never see it coming. It moves among us undetected. It takes people without warning. Hades, wearing this helm, became the embodiment of death's sneaky, inevitable approach. But the helm also had practical uses. Hades loaned it to heroes on occasion, including Perseus, who wore it during his quest to slay Medusa. This willingness to share his most powerful artifact with mortal heroes shows again that Hades could be generous and helpful when approached respectfully. One final aspect of Hades' character worth exploring is his relationship with justice and balance. In Greek thought, death was a great equalizer. In the underworld, kings and beggars were alike. Social status, wealth, power, none of it mattered after death. Everyone was judged by the same standards, and everyone ended up in their appropriate place based on how they had lived, not based on how wealthy or powerful they had been. This democratic aspect of death, this ultimate equality, was enforced by Hades. He didn't play favorites. He didn't give special treatment to royalty or famous heroes. His judgment was impartial. This impartiality is perhaps what made Hades most just. He wasn't capricious like Aphrodite, vengeful like Hera, impulsive like Ares, or lecherous like Zeus. He simply applied the law consistently and fairly. He didn't delight in punishment, but he didn't shy away from it when it was warranted. He didn't grant undeserved rewards, but he ensured that the truly heroic received their due honor. In a pantheon of gods characterized by their emotional volatility, their favoritism, and their interference in mortal affairs, Hades stood apart as the one god who simply did his job with stern, unwavering consistency. The abduction of Persephone, a love story, a myth of seasons, and a complex tale. We come now to the most famous story involving Hades, the myth that defines so much of how he's remembered. The abduction of Persephone, daughter of Zeus and Demeter. This story is told in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, one of the most beautiful and complete narratives we have from ancient Greece, and it's been retold, reinterpreted, and reimagined countless times over the millennia. It's simultaneously a love story, an origin myth explaining the seasons, a tale of a mother's grief, and a story about power, consent, and adaptation to unavoidable change. Let's explore this myth in depth, examining the different versions and what they reveal about Greek beliefs regarding marriage, death, and the natural world. The story begins in a meadow. Persephone, whose name before marriage was Kor, meaning simply maiden or daughter, was the beloved daughter of Zeus and Demeter. Demeter was the goddess of agriculture, grain, and the harvest. She was responsible for making crops grow, for ensuring the fertility of the earth, for feeding humanity. As such, she was one of the most important goddesses in Greek religion, worshipped widely and revered by farming communities. Persephone was her only daughter, and Demeter doted on her, keeping her close and protecting her carefully. One day, Persephone was out in a meadow with her companions, nymphs and other young goddesses, picking flowers. Different versions of the myth place this meadow in different locations. Some say Sicily, others say the plains of Nysa, others point to various Greek locations. The exact geography matters less than the setting itself. A beautiful, peaceful meadow full of flowers, a place of innocence and youth. Persephone was gathering crocuses, irises, violets, roses, and hyacinths. She was happy, carefree, enjoying the simple pleasure of a beautiful day. Then she noticed a flower unlike any she had seen before. A narcissus of extraordinary beauty, with 100 blooms on a single stem, radiating an enchanting fragrance. This flower, according to the Homeric hymn, had been placed there deliberately by Zeus, Persephone's father, at Hades' request, a lure to draw Persephone away from her companions to a spot where she would be vulnerable. Persephone couldn't resist such a beautiful flower. She reached down to plug it, extending both hands to gather it. At that moment, the earth split open. From the chasm that appeared, Hades emerged in his golden chariot, pulled by immortal horses. In some versions, these horses are described as dark or even black, in others as magnificent and fiery. Hades seized Persephone before she could even cry out properly, lifted her into his chariot, and plunged back through the opening in the earth which sealed behind them. The whole abduction happened in moments. Persephone's companions didn't see what happened. Her screams echoed across the mountains and valleys, reaching even to the depths of the sea, but there was no one close enough to help her, no one strong enough to defy Hades. Only 3 beings witnessed the abduction. Helios, the sun god, who sees everything from his position in the sky. Hecate, the goddess of witchcraft and crossroads, who was in her cave and heard Persephone's cries, and Zeus himself, who had arranged the whole thing. Because yes, according to the Homeric hymn and most other ancient sources, Zeus had given his permission for this abduction. Hades had gone to Zeus, his younger brother, and asked for permission to marry Persephone. Zeus agreed. In ancient Greek culture, the father's consent was the most important aspect of a marriage arrangement. The daughter's desires were secondary, and the mother's opinion was often not consulted at all. Zeus gave Hades permission to take Persephone as his wife, but he knew Demeter would never agree to the match, and he may have suspected Persephone herself wouldn't want to leave the sunlit world for the darkness of the underworld. So, the abduction was planned in secret. Modern readers understandably find this deeply troubling. By any contemporary standard, this is kidnapping, and what happens next? Persephone being forced to live in the underworld and becoming Hades' wife constitutes forced marriage at minimum. There's no way to sugarcoat it or make it less disturbing from a modern ethical perspective. However, understanding the ancient Greek context is important, not to excuse the actions, but to understand what the myth meant to the people who told it. In ancient Greek society, marriages were typically arranged by fathers, with a little input from the daughters. Girls were often married in their early teens to much older men, moving from their father's household directly to their husband's household. They had little agency in these decisions. The abduction marriage, where a groom would kidnap his bride, sometimes with her family's tacit approval as part of the arrangement, was an actual practice in some periods and regions. So, while shocking to us, the basic structure of Hades' actions would have been recognizable to ancient Greeks as an extreme version of standard marriage practices. That said, even within Greek mythology, this abduction is portrayed as transgressive. Demeter's rage at Zeus and her subsequent actions make it clear that what happened was wrong, was a violation, was unacceptable, even if it was technically legal according to patriarchal marriage customs. The entire second half of the myth is driven by Demeter's refusal to accept this arrangement and her use of her power to force the gods to make concessions. So, Persephone finds herself in the underworld. She's terrified, grieving, and angry. Hades, for his part, seems to genuinely believe this marriage is appropriate and that Persephone will eventually adapt to her new role. The Homeric hymn portrays him as somewhat oblivious to her distress, or at least convinced that she'll come to accept the situation. Different later retellings give Hades different motivations. Some portray him as having fallen genuinely in love with Persephone after seeing her in the meadow, sometimes with Eros or Cupid shooting him with an arrow at Aphrodite's instigation. Others portray him as simply wanting a wife and queen to help him rule, and others suggest he was lonely after eons of isolation and desired companionship. Meanwhile, in the world above, Demeter realized her daughter was missing. She searched everywhere, wandering the earth for 9 days and nights without eating, drinking, or bathing, carrying torches to light her way. She asked every god and mortal she encountered if they had seen Persephone, but no one would tell her the truth. Finally, on the 10th day, Hecate found her and told her she had heard Persephone's cries, but hadn't seen who took her. Together, they went to Helios, the all-seeing sun god, and demanded answers. Helios, who had witnessed the abduction, finally told Demeter the truth. Zeus had given Persephone to Hades, and she was now in the underworld. Demeter's reaction was rage and grief in equal measure. She was furious at Zeus for making this arrangement without consulting her, furious at Hades for taking her daughter, and devastated at the loss of Persephone to the realm of the dead. In her anger and sorrow, Demeter withdrew her blessing from the earth. She disguised herself as an old woman and left Olympus, wandering until she came to the city of Eleusis. There, she was taken in by the royal family and asked to serve as a nursemaid to their infant son, Demophon. Demeter, in her grief, tried to make the child immortal by anointing him with ambrosia and holding him in fire each night to burn away his mortal essence. But the queen, Metanera, walked in one night and saw her child in the flames. She screamed, interrupting the process. Demeter revealed her true form in anger, rebuking Metanera for her ignorance, and declared that Demophon could no longer be made immortal, though he would still be honored. She commanded the Eleusinians to build her a temple, and there she sat, refusing to perform her duties as goddess of agriculture. The consequences were catastrophic. Without Demeter's blessing, nothing would grow. Seeds wouldn't sprout. Crops wouldn't ripen. The harvest failed completely. Humanity began to starve. The earth became barren and desolate. Animals died. Famine spread across the world. The gods became alarmed because, without humans to worship them and make sacrifices, the gods themselves would be diminished. Zeus, realizing the severity of the situation, tried to persuade Demeter to relent. He sent messenger after messenger, every god and goddess except Hades, to plead with her, offering gifts and honors. Demeter refused them all. She would not allow anything to grow until her daughter was returned to her. Finally, Zeus had no choice. He sent Hermes, the messenger of the gods, down to the underworld with a command. Hades must release Persephone so that Demeter would end the famine. Now, here's where the myth becomes truly interesting, because Hades' response reveals much about his character and the Greek understanding of cosmic law. Hades complied with Zeus's command. He didn't rage against it or try to defy his younger brother. He accepted the decision. But before letting Persephone go, he did something that would have permanent consequences. He gave her pomegranate seeds to eat. The pomegranate is a fascinating symbol in this myth, rich with multiple layers of meaning. On the surface level, there was a rule in Greek mythology. Anyone who ate food from the underworld would be bound to it and could never fully leave. This was cosmic law, perhaps even more fundamental than Zeus's authority. By eating the pomegranate seeds, Persephone would be tied to the underworld forever, regardless of Zeus's command or Demeter's wishes. But why did Persephone eat them? This is where versions of the myth diverge significantly, and these differences reveal evolving cultural attitudes toward marriage, agency, and power. In the Homeric hymn to Demeter, the oldest version we have, it's explicitly stated that Hades secretly gave Persephone the pomegranate seeds before she left, and she ate them. When she's reunited with Demeter, Persephone tells her mother that Hades forced her to eat the seeds, using language that suggests it was done against her will or through trickery. In this version, the eating of the seeds is portrayed as one final violation, one last manipulation to ensure Persephone could never fully escape. A minor figure named Ascalaphus, who worked in Hades' orchard, witnessed Persephone eating the seeds and testified to this fact. For revealing this secret, he was punished. Different versions say he was either turned into an owl bee Persephone or Demeter, or pinned under a heavy rock by one of them until Heracles eventually freed him. The punishment of the witness suggests that eating the seeds was supposed to remain secret, that it was a shameful act that needed to be hidden. Later versions of the myth, particularly those from the Roman period and later still, sometimes portray the eating of the seeds differently. In these retellings, Persephone eats the seeds willingly, or at least more ambiguously. Some versions have Hades offering them as a kind of parting gesture, perhaps even a romantic one, and Persephone accepting them. The number of seeds varies by telling. Sometimes it's 4 seeds, sometimes 6, sometimes 7, sometimes a whole handful. The most common version says 6 seeds, which is why Persephone would spend 6 months in the underworld and 6 months above ground, creating the cycle of the seasons. Some often reinterpretations go even further, suggesting that Persephone chose to eat the seeds deliberately, knowing full well what they would do, because she had begun to accept or even embrace her role as queen of the underworld. In these versions, Persephone is portrayed as having agency, as making a choice to remain partly connected to the underworld rather than being purely a victim. While these interpretations aren't supported by the ancient sources, they reflect modern desires to see Persephone as having more power in her own story. There's also a symbolic level to the pomegranate that's worth exploring. Pomegranates were associated with fertility, marriage, and sexuality in ancient Mediterranean cultures. The fruit itself, with its many seeds contained within, was seen as a symbol of fertility and abundance. Some scholars suggest that eating the pomegranate seeds represents the consummation of the marriage between Hades and Persephone, a polite mythological euphemism for sexual relations. In this reading, once the marriage was consummated, symbolized by eating the seeds, it became permanent and couldn't be undone, which aligned with Greek marriage customs. The pomegranate's red color and juice, resembling blood, gave it additional symbolism related to life, death, and the transition between states. Some interpretations suggest the seeds represent death itself, by taking death into herself, by eating death through the pomegranate. Persephone became forever changed, no longer fully belonging to the world of the living. She had crossed a boundary that couldn't be uncrossed. Whatever the exact meaning and whatever the level of Persephone's agency in eating the seeds, the result was the same. She couldn't fully return. A compromise had to be reached. The solution, negotiated between Zeus, Hades, and Demeter, was that Persephone would spend part of each year in the underworld with Hades, and part of each year above ground with her mother. During the months when Persephone was in the underworld, Demeter would grieve and withdraw her blessing, causing autumn and winter, seasons of death and dormancy for plants. When Persephone returned to the surface, Demeter would rejoice and allow the earth to bloom again, creating spring and summer, seasons of growth and fertility. Thus, the abduction of Persephone became the mythological explanation for the annual cycle of the seasons. This is a beautiful explanatory myth, and it became central to one of the most important religious institutions in ancient Greece, the Eleusinian Mysteries. These were secret religious rites celebrated at Eleusis, the city where Demeter had stayed during her grief. The mysteries, which could only be participated in by those who had been initiated and who swore oaths never to reveal what they experienced, promised initiates a better fate after death, and a deeper understanding of the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, symbolized by Persephone's annual journey between worlds. We don't know exactly what happened during the Eleusinian mysteries. The participants kept their oaths remarkably well, but we know they involved ritual reenactments of Demeter's search for Persephone, dramatic revelations, sacred objects being displayed, and profound spiritual experiences that participants described as life-changing. The mysteries survived for nearly 2,000 years, from the Mycenaean period through the Classical Age into the Roman era, only ending when Christianity became dominant and the temple at Eleusis was closed in the 4th century CE. Persephone and Demeter, through this myth, became central to one of the most enduring and important religious traditions in the ancient world. What about Persephone's experience of all this? The Homeric hymn ends with Persephone's return to Demeter and their joyful reunion. But it doesn't tell us much about how Persephone felt about having to return to the underworld. Later sources provide more details. Some portray Persephone as perpetually sad about her fate, always grieving for the sunlit world she lost. Others portray her as adapting and even coming to embrace her role as Queen of the Underworld. By the classical period, Persephone is consistently portrayed as a powerful goddess in her own right, ruling alongside Hades with genuine authority, receiving supplicants, making judgments, and showing both compassion and severity as the situation warranted. In fact, several myths feature Persephone acting independently and powerfully. When Orpheus came to retrieve Eurydice, some versions credit Persephone with persuading Hades to allow the attempt, showing her compassion for a love that reminded her of her own story. When Psyche, in the myth of Eros and Psyche, came to the underworld to fetch a box of beauty ointment from Persephone, the goddess received her kindly and helped her. Though she warned Psyche not to open the box, advice Psyche ignored to her detriment. When Adonis was killed, both Persephone and Aphrodite claimed him, and Zeus had to settle the dispute by having Adonis spend part of the year with each goddess, paralleling Persephone's own fate. These stories show Persephone as an active agent with her own desires, powers, and authority, not just a passive victim. This transformation from kidnapped maiden to powerful queen of the underworld is itself part of what makes the myth so compelling and so amenable to reinterpretation. Persephone's story can be read as a coming-of-age narrative, a transition from maiden to wife to queen, from daughter to independent woman. It can be read as a story about adaptation to trauma, finding power and purpose even in situations not of one's choosing. It can be read as a metaphor for growth and change, for the necessity of leaving childhood innocence behind to embrace adult responsibilities. Or it can be read at face value as a troubling story about patriarchal power, forced marriage, and a woman making the best of a bad situation. Modern feminist reinterpretations of the myth often focus on reclaiming Persephone's agency, reimagining her as choosing her fate, or at least actively shaping her role as queen. Some emphasize her power in the underworld, her becoming as fearsome and authoritative as Hades himself, a goddess whom even heroes fear and respect. Others focus on her connection to cycles, to the natural process of growth death and renewal, seeing her as embodying the necessary descent into darkness that precedes rebirth. Still others examine the relationship between Persephone and Demeter, focusing on themes of our mother-daughter bonds, separation, and the necessity of children eventually leaving their parents to form their own identities. As for Hades' role in all this, modern interpretations vary wildly. Some portray him as genuinely remorseful once he understands how much pain he's caused, as learning to be a better partner to Persephone, as their relationship evolving from captive and captor to genuine partnership. Others portray him as irredeemably villainous, as an abuser who never truly changes. Still others take the position that applying modern moral standards to ancient myths is problematic, and that Hades should be understood within his cultural context, as acting according to the norms, however disturbing, of his time, while still acknowledging the genuine trauma his actions caused. What we can say from the ancient sources is that Hades and Persephone's marriage, however it began, became a functional partnership. They ruled the underworld together. They made decisions together. Persephone's throne sat beside Hades' throne at the same height, signifying equal authority. Unlike Zeus and Hera's marriage, which was characterized by constant conflict, infidelity, and power struggles, Hades and Persephone's marriage was portrayed as relatively stable and functional. Hades didn't cheat on Persephone, with the possible exception of Minty. They didn't constantly argue or undermine each other. They worked together to maintain order in their realm. Does this partnership justify or excuse how it began? No. Can we hold both truths simultaneously? That the abduction was wrong and traumatic, and that Persephone eventually found power and purpose in her role as Queen of the Underworld? Yes, Greek myths were never simple moral fables with clear heroes and villains. They were complex, ambiguous stories that reflected the complicated realities of ancient life, including arranged marriages, power imbalances between men and women, and the ways people adapt to and find meaning in situations not of their choosing. The Persephone myth ultimately gave the Greeks a way to explain the seasons, yes, but it also gave them a powerful metaphor for life, death, and transformation. Persephone descends into darkness but emerges again. She dies, in a sense, but is reborn. She is both Queen of the Dead and Bringer of Spring. She embodies the paradox that death is not an ending, but a transformation. That darkness and light are interconnected. That loss and return are part of an eternal cycle. For a culture that didn't have a clear concept of heaven or resurrection, as later religions would develop, this myth provided comfort. Death wasn't pure loss, but part of a greater cycle that included return and renewal. And Hades, through this myth, became more than just the god of death. He became the husband of the spring goddess, connected to rebirth and renewal through his wife's annual return to the surface. His realm wasn't just a place of darkness and ending, but the source from which new life would eventually spring. The seeds that died in the ground, buried in his domain, would sprout again. The darkness of winter would give way to the light of spring. Hades, the most feared god, was inextricably linked to hope, to renewal, to the promise that death is not final, but part of a greater cycle. Whether you choose to focus on the darkness or the light in this myth, on the trauma or the transformation, on the victimization or the empowerment, The story of Hades and Persephone remains one of the most powerful, complex, and endlessly interpretable myths in the Greek tradition, continuing to inspire art, literature, and thought more than 2 millennia after it was first told. Hades in other myths. The unexpected generosity of the Lord of the Dead. While the abduction of Persephone is by far the most famous myth involving Hades, it's far from the only one. Examining other stories in which Hades appears reveals consistent character traits that often surprise people familiar only with as modern villainous portrayals. Hades could be unexpectedly generous, compassionate in the face of genuine love or grief, and respectful of heroism and talent. Let's explore some of these other myths. Perhaps the most beautiful story involving Hades is the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus was the greatest musician who ever lived, so talented that when he played his lyre and sang, animals would gather to listen, rivers would change their course, and even stones would weep. He married Eurydice, a nymph, and they were deeply in love, but tragedy struck almost immediately. On their wedding day, Eurydice was bitten by a venomous snake and died. Descending to the underworld, Orpheus was devastated. His grief was so profound that his music became unbearably sad, his songs so mournful that they moved even the hardest hearts. Finally, unable to bear the loss, Orpheus made a decision that few mortals would dare. He would travel to the underworld to bring Eurydice back. Armed with only his lyre, his voice, and his love, Orpheus descended into Hades' realm through one of the physical entrances to the underworld. As he traveled through the underworld, Orpheus played his lyre and sang songs of his love for Eurydice, of his grief at losing her, of his desperate need to have her return to him. His music was so beautiful, so heartbreaking, that it affected everything in the underworld. Cerberus, the fierce, 3-headed guard dog, was lulled to sleep by the melody. The Furies, typically merciless in their pursuit of the guilty, wept at the beauty and sorrow of the music. The shades of the dead stopped their wandering to listen. Even in Tartarus, the eternal punishments briefly ceased. Sisyphus's boulder stopped rolling. Tantalus forgot his thirst and hunger. The wheel of Ixion stopped turning. All of the underworld fell silent, enchanted by Orpheus's music. Finally, Orpheus came before Hades and Persephone on their thrones. He sang directly to them, pouring out his heart, begging them to return Eurydice to him. His song reminded them of love, of beauty, of all the things worth living for in the world above. According to various ancient sources, his plea moved even Hades himself to tears, or at least to the closest thing to tears that the Lord of the Dead could experience. Here's where Hades' character becomes truly interesting. He could have simply refused. Death is supposed to be permanent. That's the cosmic law Hades guards so jealously. No one leaves the underworld. But Hades, moved by Orpheus's love and talent, and perhaps persuaded by Persephone, who in some versions is shown pleading Orpheus's case, made an unprecedented concession. He would allow Eurydice to return to the world of the living. It was an act of genuine compassion, of recognition that some things, true love, exceptional talent, deserved special consideration. But there was a condition, and this condition has made the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice one of the most poignant in all of mythology. Hades told Orpheus that Eurydice would follow him out of the underworld, but Orpheus must not look back at her until they had both reached the world of the living. If he turned to look at her before they were both safely out of Hades' realm, she would be lost to him forever. Some interpretations suggest this condition was a test of Orpheus's love and trust. Others suggest it was Hades' way of maintaining his principle that death is usually permanent. He was bending the rule, but only barely, and any violation of the terms would void the agreement. Still, others suggest it was a compassionate warning. Eurydice was still a shade, still not fully alive, and seeing her in that state might be too terrible for Orpheus to bear. Orpheus agreed and began the journey back to the surface. Eurydice's shade followed him, though she was silent. As they traveled through the dark passages of the underworld, Orpheus couldn't hear her footsteps, couldn't sense her presence. Doubt began to creep in. Was she really there? Had Hades kept his word? Or had this been a cruel trick? The journey seemed endless, and the silence was maddening. Finally, Orpheus saw light ahead. The exit, the return to the world of the living. Just as he was about to step out, just as he was on the threshold of success, doubt overwhelmed him. He turned to look back to verify that Eurydice was really there, to see her face one more time. For just a moment, he saw her. Her shade reaching out to him, her eyes filled with love and sadness, and then she began to fade, pulled back down into the depths of the underworld. Farewell, she whispered, and was gone. Orpheus tried to follow her back down, but now the gates were closed to him. Charon refused to ferry him across again. He was still alive, and the living couldn't enter the underworld except under extraordinary circumstances. Orpheus had failed at the very last moment, undone by his own lack of faith, his inability to trust completely. He spent the rest of his life grieving, playing only sad songs until he was eventually killed by frenzied followers of Dionysus. This myth is important for understanding Hades because it shows that he could be moved, that he could show mercy, that he recognized the power of love and art. The condition he imposed wasn't intended to be cruel. If it was just a test of obedience, he could have made the journey much shorter or the test much easier. The condition was, in its way, a kindness. It gave Orpheus a chance, however slim, to reclaim what death had taken. That Orpheus failed was his own fault, not Hades. Hades had kept his word, had bent the cosmic law, had shown unprecedented flexibility. Orpheus simply couldn't maintain faith long enough to receive the gift he'd been offered. Another important myth involving Hades is the 12th labor of Heracles. As punishment for having killed his wife and children in a fit of madness induced by Hera, Heracles was required to complete 12 seemingly impossible tasks. The 12th and final labor was to bring Cerberus, the three-headed guard dog of the underworld, up to the surface world to show King Eurystheus. This was meant to be an impossible task. How could anyone even reach the underworld while still alive, let alone overcome Cerberus, let alone bring the great beast to the surface? But Heracles was the greatest hero of Greek mythology, a demigod son of Zeus, known for his tremendous strength and courage. Heracles traveled to one of the entrances to the underworld and descended into Hades' realm. When he appeared before Hades and explained his purpose, Hades could have simply refused. He could have killed Heracles or trapped him in the underworld, adding one more shade to his countless subjects. But Hades respected heroism and recognized that Heracles was on a sacred quest of atonement. He agreed to allow Heracles to take Cerberus to the surface world, but only under one condition. Heracles must subdue Cerberus without using any weapons. This was a fair condition. It would prove Heracles' strength without permanently harming Cerberus, who was, after all, Hades' beloved pet and an essential guardian of the underworld. Heracles agreed. He found Cerberus at the gates and, using only his bare hands and his incredible strength, wrestled the great beast into submission. It must have been an epic struggle, but Heracles prevailed. He brought Cerberus to the surface, showed the beast to King Eurystheus, who was so terrified that he hid in a large jar, and then, true to his agreement with Hades, respectfully returned Cerberus to his post at the gates of the underworld. This myth shows several things about Hades. He was reasonable, willing to negotiate with heroes who approached him respectfully. He valued fairness. The condition he imposed on Heracles was challenging but not impossible, and it protected Cerberus from harm. He honored his agreements. Once Heracles had met the condition, Hades didn't try to trap him or prevent him from leaving. And he cared about Cerberus as more than just a tool or weapon, wanting the great dog to be treated with respect. There are other, smaller myths that feature Hades in various roles. When Theseus and his friend Pirithous attempted to abduct Persephone, because Pirithous wanted a divine wife and decided to aim high, Hades caught them and bound them to the chair of forgetfulness, where they remained trapped. When Heracles later descended to the underworld for his labor, he freed Theseus, but Hades wouldn't allow Pirithous to be freed. His crime of attempting to kidnap the queen of the underworld was too severe. This shows Hades' sense of proportional justice. Theseus, who had gone along with his friend's scheme but hadn't initiated it, could be pardoned. Pirithous, the instigator, deserved ongoing punishment. When Asclepius, the god of medicine, became so skilled that he could resurrect the dead, Hades complained to Zeus that Asclepius was violating the natural order, interfering with Hades' domain by bringing souls back from death. Zeus agreed and struck Asclepius down with a thunderbolt. This wasn't Hades being cruel or petty. It was him protecting a fundamental cosmic principle. If the dead could be routinely resurrected, death would lose its meaning, and the boundary between life and death that Hades was charged with maintaining would collapse. In various hero myths, when mortals descended to the underworld seeking knowledge, favors, or to complete quests, Hades generally allowed them to leave again if they approached respectfully and didn't try to violate the rules of his realm. Odysseus, in Book 11 of the Odyssey, came to the underworld to consult the prophet Tiresias, performed the proper rituals, and was allowed to leave safely. Aeneas, in Virgil's Aeneid, traveled through the underworld to speak with his father's shade, and was guided by the Sibyl, given permission to enter and to leave. These descents into the underworld by living heroes, a motif called catabasis, were dangerous but possible, and Hades generally tolerated them as long as the heroes showed proper respect. In all these myths, a pattern emerges. Hades was a god who could be stern, inflexible about his primary responsibilities, and unwilling to allow violations of cosmic law, but he was also fair, occasionally compassionate, and willing to show flexibility when circumstances warranted it, and when he was approached with proper respect. He wasn't a villain trying to increase suffering or prevent happiness. He was a ruler trying to maintain order, honor his responsibilities, and protect the boundaries that kept the cosmos functioning properly. The contrast with other gods is striking. Zeus would capriciously help or harm mortals, based on momentary whims or romantic interests. Hera would viciously punish innocent people who had been victimized by her husband. Poseidon would destroy entire cities because someone offended him. Aphrodite would ruin lives with her manipulations of love and desire. But Hades, he stayed in his realm, did his job, and when heroes approached him respectfully, with reasonable requests, he often found ways to accommodate them within the limits of cosmic law. He was, in many ways, more predictable and more fair than any of his Olympian siblings. Symbols, attributes, and the sparse worship of the unseen one. Every Greek god had specific symbols, sacred animals, plants, and objects associated with them that helped identify them in art and that connected them to specific aspects of life and nature. Hades was no exception, though his symbols reflected his unique position as the god whom Greeks both feared and avoided. The most important symbol of Hades was the Helm of Darkness, also called the Helm of Invisibility, which we've already discussed. This cap, or helmet, forged by the Cyclopes during the Titanomachy, rendered its wearer completely invisible and undetectable. It was one of the three great weapons of the Olympian brothers, along with Zeus's thunderbolt and Poseidon's trident. The helm symbolized Hades' own nature as the unseen one, the meaning of his name, and represented death's sneaky, unexpected nature. It comes without warning, invisible until it's too late. The ancient Greeks had an interesting relationship with invisibility. Unlike modern superhero fantasies, where invisibility is often used for pranks or spying, the Greeks saw invisibility as deeply connected to the divine and the terrifying. Gods could make themselves invisible to mortals. Death itself was invisible. The Helm of Darkness, therefore, wasn't just a cool, magical item. It was a symbol of divine power over visibility and perception, of the boundary between the seen and unseen worlds. When Hades wore the helm, he became, like death itself, present but not visible, acting but not seen, until it was too late to escape. Hades' other primary symbol was his staff or scepter, and in later artistic representations, a bident, a two-pronged spear or pitchfork, similar to Poseidon's trident but with 2 points instead of 3. The bident became Hades' signature weapon and tool of authority in Roman and later Greek art, though it's not mentioned in the earliest Greek sources. Some scholars suggest the bident represents the duality of Hades' nature. He was both the god of death and the god of wealth, both feared and necessary, both the ender of life and the source of new growth. Others suggest it's simply a later artistic invention to give Hades a distinctive weapon to parallel his brother's famous armaments. Cerberus, the three-headed dog, was so closely associated with Hades that he essentially functioned as a living symbol of the god. To see Cerberus was to know you were in or near Hades' realm. The great hound represented not just guardianship, but also loyalty and the fierce protection of boundaries. In some later traditions, Cerberus came to represent the past, present, and future. 3 heads watching all of time, or the 3 stages of life, youth, adulthood, and old age, that all lead eventually to death. Plant symbols associated with Hades included the cypress tree and the asphodel flower. The cypress was a funerary plant in Greek and Roman culture, often planted near graves and tombs. Its dark, towering form made it appropriate for mourning and remembrance. Cypress wood was used in funeral pyres and for making coffins. The tree became so strongly associated with death and mourning that it naturally became sacred to Hades. In Greek art and literature, cypress trees often appear in underworld scenes, and cypress groves were considered liminal spaces, places where the boundary between life and death was thin. The asphodel was the flower of the dead, giving its name to the asphodel meadows where ordinary souls dwelt. It was a common wildflower in Greece, often growing in uncultivated places. Its association with the underworld may have come from its pale color and the fact that it often grew on graves and in abandoned areas. In symbolic terms, the asphodel represented the neutral, colorless existence of most souls after death. Not tormented, but not blessed either. Just existing in a gray, flower-filled eternity. The narcissus flower, which lured Persephone to the spot where Hades abducted her, also became associated with death and the underworld. Narcissus flowers were often planted on graves in Greek culture, and their beautiful but somewhat melancholy appearance made them appropriate funeral flowers. The myth of Narcissus himself, the youth who fell in love with his own reflection and died, reinforced the flower's association with death and the danger of self-absorption. The white poplar tree was another plant sacred to Hades, with an interesting mythological origin. According to legend, a nymph named Luce was loved by Hades. When she died, even the love interests of gods must die eventually, it seems. Hades transformed her into a white poplar tree in the Elysian fields. When Heracles descended to the underworld to capture Cerberus, he made a crown from the branches of this white poplar. The leaves of the poplar are green on top and silver white underneath, which was explained as the leaves being darkened by smoke from below, from the underworld, while remaining white on the upper surface, facing toward the sky and the world above. This two-tone nature made the poplar an appropriate symbol for Hades, who existed at the boundary between worlds. In terms of sacred animals beyond Cerberus, Hades was associated with snakes and owls. Snakes were chthonic creatures, living in holes in the ground, cold-blooded, often venomous, and thus connected to the underworld. Some versions of myths had Hades taking the form of a serpent. The owl, particularly the screech owl or barn owl, was associated with Hades because of its nocturnal nature, its silent flight, like death approaching unheard, and its haunting calls. When Ascalaphus, the gardener in Hades' realm, who testified about Persephone eating the pomegranate seeds, was punished for telling, he was transformed into an owl, specifically a screech owl or eagle owl, whose harsh cry was thereafter considered a bad omen. Hades was also strongly associated with keys, representing his role as gatekeeper of the underworld. He held the keys to the gates of death, and those keys were always turned in one direction, locked. The image of Hades holding a key, or keys, appears in various ancient artworks, and reinforced the idea that the underworld was a locked realm, a place from which there was no escape without Hades' permission. The key symbolized his absolute authority over access to and egress from his domain. The cornucopia, or horn of plenty, was sometimes associated with Hades in his aspect as Pluton, the wealthy one. This may seem strange. Why would the god of death be associated with a symbol of abundance? The answer lies in his connection to the earth's fertility and mineral wealth. As the god who controlled everything beneath the earth's surface, Hades had dominion over seeds germinating in the soil, over the precious metals and gems hidden in the depths, over the fertility that comes from the earth. The cornucopia represented this hidden abundance, this wealth that came from below. As for worship in temples, Hades was in a unique position among Greek gods. He had very few temples. Most Greek gods had temples throughout the Greek world. Zeus had temples everywhere. Athena had the Parthenon and numerous other temples. Apollo had temples at Delphi and Delos, and many other sites, and so on. But Hades, ancient sources report that he had perhaps one temple in all of Greece, located at Elis in the Peloponnese, and even that one was opened only once per year. There may have been a few other cult sites dedicated to him, but they were rare and obscure. This absence of temples wasn't because Greeks didn't respect Hades or didn't recognize his importance. Rather, it was because worshipping Hades seemed dangerous. To draw his attention, to focus on death, felt like tempting fate. Greeks generally preferred to worship gods associated with life, protection, prosperity, and victory. Gods who would actively help them. Hades didn't really help anyone in life. He simply waited for everyone to eventually come to him in death. There was no point in trying to curry favor with him, because death was inevitable regardless. You couldn't bribe death, or flatter death, or pray your way out of death. So, why build temples? When Greeks did perform rituals related to Hades, they were typically conducted at home or in wild places, rather than in formal temples. Sacrifices to Hades, as mentioned earlier, were made differently than sacrifices to Olympian gods. Black animals, sheep, bulls, or pigs, would be chosen. The blood would be poured into a pit in the ground, rather than onto an altar. The person performing the sacrifice would avert their face rather than looking toward the sky. These sacrifices were called chthonic sacrifices, distinguished from Olympian sacrifices by their downward orientation toward the earth rather than upward toward the heavens. Interestingly, Hades was sometimes worshipped under his alternative names or euphemisms rather than directly. As Plauton, the wealthy one, he might receive sacrifices and prayers from farmers hoping for good harvests, or miners hoping to strike rich veins of ore. These rituals focused on his positive aspect, as provider of earthly abundance rather than on his darker role as Lord of the Dead. It was considered safer to approach Hades through his benevolent aspect rather than confronting him directly as the god of death. The Eleusinian mysteries, the secret religious rites celebrating Demeter and Persephone, involved Hades in so far as he was Persephone's husband and the ruler of the realm she returned to each year. Participants in the mysteries hoped to receive Persephone and Hades' favor in the afterlife, to perhaps be granted a better fate after death than the gray existence of the Asphodel Meadows. But even in the mysteries, the focus was more on Demeter and Persephone than on Hades himself. He remained a peripheral figure even in rituals that directly involved his domain. This avoidance, this lack of worship, must have reinforced Hades' isolation. While his siblings on Olympus received constant sacrifices, prayers, hymns, and festivals, Hades received very little of that attention. His name was avoided. His temples were few. His festivals were rare. He was necessary but unwanted, essential but unloved, powerful but alone. It's little wonder that he rarely left the underworld and showed little interest in Olympian affairs. He had built his own realm, his own kingdom, separate from his siblings' world, and there he could at least have absolute authority and unquestioned respect, even if it came from fear rather than affection. Relationships and family, the god of the dead's personal life. Despite his isolation from Olympus and his fearsome reputation, Hades had a family and personal relationships that reveal softer aspects of his character. We've already discussed his relationship with Persephone at length, but it's worth reiterating. Unlike virtually every other male god in Greek mythology, Hades was faithful to his wife. This fidelity was remarkable and speaks to either genuine love for Persephone, or at least profound respect for the marriage bond, or perhaps simply that Hades' personality was less impulsive, firm, and more controlled than other gods. Zeus, king of the gods, had dozens of affairs with goddesses, nymphs, and mortal women. His infidelities were legendary and caused tremendous suffering to both his wife Hera and to the women he pursued, many of whom had no choice in the matter. Poseidon was almost as bad, fathering numerous children with various partners. Apollo had multiple famous love affairs. Even Hephaestus, the often overlooked god of smithing, had affairs. But Hades? Once he married Persephone, he was apparently content with her. This fidelity is especially notable given that Hades and Persephone spent significant time apart each year. For several months, Persephone would be above ground with her mother, leaving Hades alone in the underworld. He could have taken advantage of her absence to pursue other women. He didn't. This suggests either that their relationship, once established, became genuinely loving and committed, or that Hades simply wasn't interested in romantic pursuits beyond securing a queen to help him rule. Some ancient sources suggest that Hades and Persephone had children, though the accounts are confusing and contradictory. The most commonly mentioned child is Zagreus, who appears in Orphic religious texts as a son of Zeus and Persephone, who was killed and dismembered by the Titans, then later reborn as Dionysus. However, some versions make Zagreus a son of Hades instead of Zeus, which would make more sense given Persephone's actual marriage. Zagreus is associated with Orphic mystery religion and concepts of rebirth and transformation. Another daughter, sometimes attributed to Hades and Persephone, is Meleno, a goddess associated with ghosts, nightmares, and madness. She was said to have a dual-colored appearance, one side bright and one side dark, representing her dual parentage and her nature as existing between worlds. Meleno was invoked in certain magical rituals and was said to wander the earth at night, leading ghosts and causing fear. She represented the intrusive, haunting quality of death, the way thoughts of mortality can strike unexpectedly, the way the dead can haunt the living through memory and dream. A third daughter sometimes mentioned is Macaria, a goddess of blessed death. She was said to preside over deaths that were peaceful, honorable, or heroic. Deaths in battle for one's homeland. Deaths after long fulfilled lives. Deaths that brought honor rather than tragedy. If Meleno represented death's frightening aspects, Macaria represented death's potentially blessed nature, the idea that dying well was something to aspire to. The confusion and contradictions in these accounts may stem from the fact that different Greek regions and different religious traditions had varying beliefs about the underworld and its divine inhabitants. What we can say is that Hades and Persephone, as king and queen of the underworld, had various spirits, demons, and minor deities associated with them who might have been considered their children, or their servants, or their manifestations. The underworld was their domain, and everything in it was, in a sense, part of their household. Hades' relationship with his siblings was complicated by his physical separation from them. Zeus, Poseidon, Hera, Demeter, and Hestia all had access to Mount Olympus and participated in the councils and gatherings of the gods. Hades rarely attended. Some sources suggest he avoided Olympus because he felt unwelcome or unwanted there. Others suggest he simply preferred his own realm and had little interest in Olympian politics and drama. His relationship with Zeus, his youngest brother, who would become king of the gods, seems to have been respectful but distant. Zeus had authority as king, but Hades ruled his own domain absolutely. They cooperated when necessary. Zeus's permission was needed for Hades to marry Persephone. Zeus sent commands to Hades when the needs of the cosmos required it, like ordering Persephone's return to prevent famine. And Hades generally complied with Zeus's commands, but they weren't close. There's no suggestion in the myths that they socialized or confided in each other. Their relationship was functional and formal, more like distant colleagues than brothers. With Poseidon, the relationship might have been slightly warmer, as they had both been swallowed by Cronus and had shared that traumatic experience. Both of them ruled realms away from Olympus, Poseidon in the ocean depths, Hades in the underworld, which gave them something in common. But Poseidon, unlike Hades, frequently left his realm to interact with mortals and gods. He was involved in various wars, competitions, and dramas. Hades simply wasn't interested in such things. So, while there's no suggestion of conflict between them, there's also no indication of particular closeness. His relationship with his sisters is even less documented. Demeter became his mother-in-law through his marriage to Persephone, and that relationship started very badly, given the whole abduction thing. Over time, presumably, they reached some kind of accommodation, given that the seasonal arrangement allowed Persephone to spend half the year with her mother. But they were never portrayed as close or as having a warm relationship. Hera, as Zeus's wife and queen of the gods, presumably had some formal relationship with Hades as king of the underworld, but they're never shown interacting directly in surviving myths. Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, was one of the least mentioned Olympians despite being one of the original 6 siblings, and her relationship with Hades, if any, is not recorded. In other words, Hades was isolated even from his own family. This isolation might have been partially by choice. He found Olympian society distasteful or too chaotic, and partially imposed by the nature of his domain and his responsibilities. Ruling the underworld required constant attention. He couldn't abandon his post for extended periods to socialize on Olympus without risking chaos in his realm. So, he stayed in the underworld, ruling with Persephone, maintaining the cosmic order, ensuring the dead remained dead and that justice was served, but largely separated from the bright, chaotic world of the Olympian gods. This isolation makes Hades a tragic figure in some ways. He wasn't evil or cruel, but he was alone, feared, and misunderstood. He had one of the most important jobs in the cosmos, managing death and the afterlife, but received almost no gratitude or recognition for it. He was necessary but unwanted, powerful but unloved, dutifully performing his role while his siblings enjoyed festivals, worship, and social connections. Is it any wonder he rarely smiled? The legacy of Hades, modern interpretations, and cultural evolution. As we near the end of our journey through Hades' story, it's worth examining how this ancient god has been interpreted, reinterpreted, and reimagined through those centuries, and especially in modern times. The evolution of Hades in cultural memory tells us as much about changing attitudes toward death, morality, and power as it does about the god himself. In the Hellenistic period and the Roman era, Hades, or Pluto as the Romans called him, remained largely as he had been in earlier Greek thought: feared, respected, associated with both death and wealth, rarely depicted in art or literature except when the narrative required interaction with the underworld. The Romans added little that was new to his mythology, though they did emphasize his Pluto aspect more prominently, seeing him as a god of agricultural fertility and mineral wealth as much as a god of death. With the rise of Christianity, attitudes toward Hades and the Greek underworld began to shift dramatically. Christian theology had its own underworld, hell, ruled by Satan, the devil, the embodiment of evil, and the enemy of God. The parallels were superficial, but seemed obvious. Both hell and Hades were underground realms associated with death. Both were ruled by a powerful dark figure. Both were places the living feared. Early Christian writers and artists began conflating Hades with Satan, or at least using Hades as a precedent or prototype for Christian concepts of hell. This conflation was deeply misleading. Hades was not evil, was not in rebellion against the other gods, was not actively trying to corrupt or torment souls. But the parallels were convenient for Christian polemics against pagan religion. Pagan gods were often recast as demons or devils in Christian thought, and Hades, as the most obviously dark of the Greek gods, was an easy target for demonization. The word Hades itself was adopted into Christian theology as a name for the realm of the dead, or even for hell itself, further cementing the association. This Christianized understanding of Hades as essentially a Satan figure persisted through the medieval period and into modernity, when Western culture began to rediscover and romanticize classical mythology in the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods. Hades was often portrayed through this Christian lens as dark, probably evil, certainly antagonistic. This interpretation continued into modern popular culture, reaching its apex, or nadir, depending on your perspective, with Disney's Hercules. The Disney film is the most influential modern portrayal of Hades for younger generations. Hades, as a fast-talking, scheming, fire-haired villain, became the default mental image for millions of people. The character was entertaining, certainly, but he bore almost no resemblance to the ancient god. Still, the film's popularity meant that this version of Hades achieved cultural dominance in a way no scholarly work or accurate retelling could match. For better or worse, Disney's Hades became the Hades for much of modern popular consciousness. However, there's been a counter-movement in recent years, particularly in the last 2 decades, toward more nuanced and accurate portrayals of Greek mythology, and of Hades specifically. This shift has been driven by several factors: increased popular interest in mythology beyond children's adaptations, the influence of academic classical studies becoming more accessible through the internet, and a general cultural move toward more complex, morally ambiguous storytelling. The Percy Jackson series by Rick Riordan, while still portraying Hades as somewhat antagonistic in the first book, notably moves away from making him a pure villain. Reardon's Hades is grumpy, isolated, and feeling disrespected by the other gods. But he's not evil. He has legitimate grievances. He follows rules. And he ultimately isn't the main antagonist of the series. This more nuanced portrayal introduced many young readers to a more accurate version of Hades. The video game Hades by Supergiant Games, released in 2020, has been particularly influential in presenting Hades as a complex, morally gray character rather than a villain. In the game, Hades is stern, demanding, and can be harsh with his son, Zagreus, the player character. But he's not evil. He's shown as a dedicated ruler overwhelmed by responsibility, struggling with family relationships, and ultimately motivated by concern for his son and his realm, even if he expresses it poorly. The game portrays Persephone and Hades' relationship as complex and historically troubled, but not abusive, showing them as partners who genuinely care for each other despite their problems. This nuanced, even sympathetic portrayal has reached millions of players and has done significant work in rehabilitating Hades' reputation in popular culture. Various novels, particularly in the genre of mythological retellings aimed at adult readers, have also contributed to this rehabilitation. Books like Madeline Miller's The Song of Achilles, though not focused on Hades, and countless other mythology-inspired novels have approached Greek gods as complex characters rather than heroes or villains. When Hades appears in these stories, he's often portrayed more in line with ancient sources. Stern but fair, isolated but not malicious, associated with death but not evil. The Greek myth retelling movement, particularly feminist retellings, has paid significant attention to the Persephone myth. Books like Receiver of Many by Rachel Alexander, poems by various contemporary poets, and the ongoing Lore Olympus webcomic by Rachel Smythe have all grappled with the abduction of Persephone and Hades' role in it. These retellings range widely in how they handle the problematic aspects of the myth. Some keep the abduction but show Hades as remorseful, and the relationship as eventually becoming healthy. Some reimagine the abduction as more consensual than the ancient sources suggest. Some emphasize Persephone's eventual power and agency as queen of the underworld, and some directly confront the darkness of the myth, while still finding meaning and value in the characters. What's particularly interesting is how modern retellings often emphasize aspects of Hades' character that were present in ancient sources but not particularly highlighted. His fidelity to Persephone, his fairness and justice, his respect for boundaries and rules, his isolation and loneliness. These traits make him compelling to modern audiences who value loyalty, consistency, and competence. In a world of workplace dramas and discussions about toxic masculinity, a god who does his job well, honors his commitments, respects his wife, and doesn't constantly cause drama has unexpected appeal. There's also been a modern tendency to see Hades as a countercultural or misunderstood figure, perhaps reflecting modern anxieties about being perceived as different or dark. Goth and alternative subcultures have somewhat adopted Hades as a patron figure, seeing in him someone who embraces darkness, not as evil, but as necessity, someone who stands apart from mainstream society, represented by Olympus, by choice or circumstance. This identification with Hades as an outsider or misunderstood figure has its own problems. It can romanticize isolation, or miss the genuine difficulties of his position, but it speaks to how mythological figures continue to evolve in meaning as culture changes. The academic study of Greek mythology has also contributed to a more nuanced understanding of Hades. Scholars examining ancient texts, religious practices, and archaeological evidence have emphasized that the ancient Greeks didn't see Hades as evil or as an enemy of humanity. They've highlighted the lack of malicious myths about Hades, his relative restraint compared to other gods, and the important social and religious functions his worship served. This scholarly work, while not reaching as wide an audience as entertainment media, has informed how educators, journalists, and creators approach these myths. What can we learn from this evolution in how Hades is understood? Perhaps that our myths reflect our anxieties and values as much as they reflect those of the cultures that originally created them. Ancient Greeks feared death, but recognized its necessity and saw Hades as the embodiment of that necessary but frightening force. Christians feared damnation and saw Hades as a prototype of hell and its ruler. Modern audiences, dealing with questions about power, consent, isolation, and the meaning of death in a largely secular age, see in Hades a complex figure whose story can speak to our concerns and questions. Hades hasn't changed. The ancient myths are what they are, written in texts thousands of years old. But our understanding of those myths, what we emphasize, what we interpret, what we find meaningful, has changed dramatically. In that sense, Hades continues to live and evolve, serving as a canvas onto which each generation projects its own understanding of death, power, isolation, justice, and the boundaries between worlds. Conclusion. Understanding the Shadow Ruler. As we emerge from the depths of this exploration, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned about Hades, the Lord of the Dead, the King of the Underworld, the Shadow Ruler who has been so misunderstood for so long. Hades was not evil. This is perhaps the most important takeaway. He was stern, yes. He was inflexible about certain cosmic laws, certainly. He presided over a realm that all mortals feared because it represented the end of life as they knew it. But he was not malicious, not cruel for cruelty's sake, not a villain trying to increase suffering. He was a god with an impossible job, managing death, maintaining the boundary between life and the afterlife, ensuring that the natural order remained intact. And he performed that job with diligence, fairness, and more compassion than he's typically given credit for. He was isolated both by choice and by circumstance. His realm was separate from Olympus, and his presence was largely unwanted in the bright world of the Olympian gods. He received little worship, few honors, and almost no affection, despite being as essential to the cosmic order as Zeus or any other god. He adapted to this isolation by building his own kingdom, creating his own order, and eventually finding a partner in Persephone to share his rule and his existence. He was just. More than perhaps any other Greek god, Hades embodied consistent application of law and principle. He didn't play favorites. He didn't grant special treatment based on bribes or flattery. He enforced the rules of his realm fairly, and when he made exceptions for Orpheus, for Heracles, for other heroes, he did so based on exceptional circumstances, and always with conditions that tested whether the exception was truly warranted. His relationship with Persephone, however it began, became a genuine partnership. Unlike the dysfunctional, conflict-filled relationships between other divine couples, Hades and Persephone ruled the underworld together as equals, with Persephone having real authority and Hades remaining faithful to her in ways no other male god demonstrated. The myths surrounding Hades teach us about Greek attitudes toward death, justice, boundaries, and the necessity of accepting inevitable things. His kingdom, with its careful divisions between Tartarus, Asphodel, and Elysium, reflected Greek beliefs about moral accountability and the importance of how one lived one's life. His strict guarding of the boundary between life and death reflected the Greek understanding that death must be permanent, that the natural order requires certain things to remain fixed, that not everything can or should be negotiable. In our modern age, perhaps Hades can teach us something different: the value of doing necessary but thankless work with dignity, the importance of consistency and fairness in positions of power, the possibility of finding meaning and partnership even in dark or isolated circumstances, and the reality that fear doesn't equal evil. The most frightening things in life, death foremost among them, are often not malicious but simply inevitable, and facing them requires courage rather than denunciation. Hades sits on his ebony throne in the depths of the earth, ruling his vast kingdom of shadows, maintaining the cosmic order that allows life itself to have meaning. Without death, life would be endless and therefore meaningless. Without endings, there could be no new beginnings. Without the underworld, the world above could not exist. Hades, in accepting his lot, in ruling his dark domain, in maintaining those necessary boundaries, provides an essential service to existence itself. He deserves better than to be dismissed as a villain, better than to be conflated with demons or devils, better than to be feared without understanding. He deserves to be recognized as he was by those who first told his stories, as a god who might be stern and remote, but who was ultimately just, necessary, and in his own way, as worthy of respect as any other divine power. So, the next time you encounter Hades in a story, a game, a film, or any other medium, I hope you'll remember the real god behind the modern stereotypes. Remember the god who wept at Orpheus's music. Remember the god who allowed Heracles to borrow Cerberus. Remember the god who remained faithful to his wife when no other god could. Remember the god who simply did his job day after day, age after age, maintaining the boundary between life and death so that both could exist. And if you found value in this deep exploration of Hades and the mythology surrounding him, I'd love it if you'd hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We'll be exploring more myths, more gods, more stories from ancient cultures, always looking beyond the modern reinterpretations to find the fascinating truths that ancient peoples believed about their world and their gods. Until next time, may your journey through the myths be enlightening, and may you never fear the shadow ruler who waits, patient and eternal, at the end of all our paths. Sleep well, dear listener. Sleep well.